it's circling. And now I put a 30-second timer on it. So I think, that means that it's gonna have this countdown.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, it's been a crazy day.
Very.
Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to Taking Shots. I'm Angela Rasmussen, or Dr. Angela Rasmussen, but you can just call me Angie. And I'm here to welcome you to yet another episode of me and my wonderful co-host and colleague, Jessica Malaty Rivera, who has now just appeared in the studio. And we are going to unpack the two action-packed hearings that Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had yesterday in front of the House Ways and Means Committee. It was a full committee hearing, as well as in the afternoon, he went to visit the House Appropriations Budget Committee or Subcommittee on HHS and labor and a bunch of other things. But it's the part of the Appropriations Subcommittee that handles the Health and Human Services Department that RFK Jr. is in charge of. So the main topic of this was supposed to be RFK's defending the cuts to HHS that are in the White House's most recent budget request. What we're going to talk about is how successful he was at doing that within the constraints of, kind of keep it down with that anti-vax stuff, Bobby, because the midterms are coming up and it's not polling well with the voters. So he had to really, I think, toe a very careful line, trying to balance his own desire to be a crazy anti-vaxxer who doesn't support public health with his political demands to act like he's more or less like a normal guy who, extracts penises from dead raccoons on the side of the road. But I'm going to just stop there. And, we've had 24 hours to digest it, Jess. Like, again, yesterday I asked you what was your favorite or, your most remarkable moment. And I just keep coming back to all this measles stuff. I don't know what you think, but what have you in the 24 hours since these wild couple of hearings? Like, what are you thinking about today?
Honestly, and perhaps it was because I was just today talking to a psychiatrist friend whose specialty is ADHD, and she is a woman of color, talking just about how heinous, how racist, how eugenicist it was for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to say that all Black children are prescribed benzos, ADHD medication like Adderall, and SSRIs, which are known to cause violent behavior, and that therefore they should be potentially rehomed and reparented. To which he lied pathologically, said he wasn't even familiar with the phrase reparented, which he said verbatim on a podcast just over a year ago. To lie so egregiously under oath is now becoming a normal thing. And it's both the lie that is deeply offensive and the fact that he said this, because to me, that felt like boilerplate language that they've used before. So it was not an unfamiliar term to him by any means. This is what he talks about and believes when he's not under oath on a hot mic, right? He is not lying about those beliefs. That's what he actually believes. And he is now just saying it in front of everybody. And while trying to backpedal, of course, and say that he doesn't believe those things, and then deflecting with the other round of questioning that it was absurd because he was being asked if he had ever parented a Black child, which was not the point of the questioning. The point of the questioning was that he was A, unqualified for the position, which he is, and B, deeply, deeply misguided at best, and horribly racist and vile at worst.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the things that I think is really the most disturbing about the many, scientifically incorrect ideas that he has, are his ideas on race. He has incorporated these into virtually every pseudoscientific topic that he has opined on. And I mean, just the concept of there is a race of people, which, by the way, for everybody watching, in case you don't know, race is not actually what scientists would refer to as a genotype. Race is not genetic. Race is a social construct that we have come up with. There is no such scientific thing as race. There's no genetic basis for saying that there are races of people. So anytime somebody starts to talk about genetics in the context of race, we are really talking about somebody who is talking about ideas that are in fact racist and eugenicist. And Kennedy has been talking about this all over the place for a very long time beyond this reparenting thing. The concept of reparenting, though, I think is also just kind of mind-blowing, because when you think about it, what Kennedy is saying here is that Black children who have ADHD, and I'm assuming also depression and perhaps anxiety, since that's what SSRIs and benzodiazepines are used to treat. But, you know, if any Black child is deemed to not have good parents, they will be taken away from their parents and put into custody of something Robert F. Kennedy Jr. decides, which he has also said should be a, quote, wellness farm that will allow children to be outside doing, you know, getting their blood flowing with some physical work. And boy, taking Black children away from their parents and putting them to work in an agricultural setting sure sounds a fuck of a lot like slavery to me, or at least practices that were commonplace when slavery was legal in the American South. So just the fact that Kennedy said this at one point on a podcast, and as you pointed out, Jess, like, he does in fact say this because we have the tape of him saying it, and it's quite obviously Robert F. Kennedy Jr. saying it. So he's making these claims, he's making these statements, he's advocating for practices that were part of something that is one of the most shameful episodes in American history. And he's claiming that it's scientific. I mean, he's claiming that this is the type of gold standard science that the Department of Health and Human Services is making decisions on. In the past, he has made comments to the effect that COVID-19, or SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, was engineered by the Chinese to be a, quote, ethnic bioweapon. He said this while he was on the campaign trail for president. It was an ethnic bioweapon designed to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people, essentially. While white and Black people, white European people and Black people, or people of African and Asian descent, would suffer more COVID, or not East Asian descent, but every other Asian descent would suffer worse COVID because the virus has been genetically engineered to do that. And first of all, the virus wasn't genetically engineered. I've covered that separately in my own research and in our discussions. But second of all, it's not possible to engineer a virus at all to target races of people, because race is not something that actually exists scientifically. It's not.
It especially doesn't exist on cell receptors, which is how he tried to sound scientific in his tirade about this. He kept talking about how the receptors were specifically designed to only be attaching to the cells of certain people of certain race. Last I checked, Angie, and it's been a minute since I've been in a lab looking at these cells, receptors also don't have race.
So they don't. That's correct. And what he was doing, you know, this is his favorite tactic. And he did this multiple times yesterday, actually, also. He starts with something that has a grain of truth.
Yeah.
And then he turns it into something else. And this is actually one of the tactics that the anti-vax movement in general has been using, where they start with something that's real and verifiable, but also that's very difficult to understand, that's very technical scientifically often, and that always is in a certain context. He will take it, oversimplify it, exaggerate it, blow it out of proportions, and make it easy for people to digest. So it makes it really hard to push back against it, because as you will see right now, I'm about to tell you what he based that claim about those receptors on. There was a paper, a not very good paper, but a fine paper. It's published in a like sort of average journal. I don't remember which one, but it was peer reviewed. And it was a study of what are called single nucleotide variants. This is in your DNA. There will be, mutations. Many of these don't really do anything. They don't change the amino acid that the protein is coding for. It might be in a completely non-coding part of the genome, often is. But these are called single nucleotide variants or polymorphisms or SNPs. And they're kind of like a genomic fingerprint. Well, they can happen inside receptor genes as well. And it doesn't mean the receptor's that different. It might change it a little bit, but not that much. It can change it a lot, but that's pretty rare. And people throughout the population will have these SNVs or SNPs scattered throughout these genes. And so there are some of these things in the receptor for SARS coronavirus 2, or its molecule called ACE2. There's different ACE2 variants that people have, and they do tend to stay within populations because that's how people are identified as being one race, or ethnicity is another. They're related to each other. So there is that genetic component of it, even though the concept itself is not genetic. So anyways, you can try to say, well, we looked at people who identified as this race and they had more of these variants. So that looks like, oh, they have worse COVID. They looked at hospital records or something. They did some kind of correlation analysis. It's not very robust, and made this conclusion and published this fairly forgettable paper. And RFK Jr. gets a hold of this paper, and the anti-vaxxers do this stuff all the time. Insignificant paper that nobody really paid attention to, and turns it into, it's an ethnic bioweapon that targets like these guys and leaves out, Jews and Chinese people, but everybody else, it's gonna kill them. It makes no sense, and it's openly racist. And I think everybody needs to understand that racism is not just like some people being mean. It's very much a health issue. And everything from equitable access to healthcare, equitable access to vaccination, and the way people are treated within our healthcare system, and the health problems they have because of all of these systemic problems that they are suffering greater rates of certain diseases, including his favorite, chronic disease, because in this country, in the US, Black people are a population that has been medically neglected. Their health has been neglected, and they have been on the receiving end of serious inequity. And that's the problem. It's not because they're Black, and it's not because there's a scientific basis to it either.
No. There are so many terrible, and I mentioned this yesterday, and I want people to understand, like, when I wish that he was dumb. I actually think he's very smart and very strategic. And so when he says these things, he is thinking about, is this memorable and is this repeatable? And so many things that Bobby Kennedy says are memorable and repeatable. And those are the things that lose their affiliation with truth, lose their affiliation with a citation, and continue to spread prolifically on the internet, in conversations, in chat groups, in conversations. And I just feel like people are not looking at the bigger picture of the imprecision of this language, or of the rather precision of it, because what they're trying to do is make enough people repeat these things so it seems like consensus. That's not how we achieve consensus. We achieve consensus through killing ourselves over reproducibility and really transparent methodology. And this came up yesterday multiple times. The idea that he thinks he sounds like somebody who understands how a study should be designed. He thinks he understands what rigorous gold standard science is when he starts spouting off scientific jargon about placebos, about randomization, about controls. He doesn't actually know what those things are, and uses that kind of like gray understanding, this murky understanding, as a way to make him sound like he does have the credibility, the authority, or the expertise to be opining on things like study design for vaccines or study design for anything, fill in the blanks. I mean, the subject of Tylenol came up again, and he repeatedly said incorrect facts about what the study design was like, and who and why it was, in his idea, bad science. Bad science to them is almost becoming like the uselessness of the word misinformation, right? It's become a slur. It's become a zing, a way to say fake news. I don't believe that. That's woke. That's left. That's whatever. When they say bad science, it's making them sound like they actually understand the science when they don't.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation so many times, and we're going to keep having it, I think, because there is a really, really Orwellian component to everything that Bobby Kennedy does. And I think that, I spend all this time looking through history to figure out how, methods basically we can use to try to fight back. And one thing I just constantly keep getting stuck on is Stalin and
Yeah.
Lysenko and
Lysenko.
everything that happens there.
Yes.
And, that's what Orwell was basing the book 1984, Big Brother, was based on. Uncle Joe is what my husband, who grew up in the Soviet Union until he was 30, told me they used to call him, sort of behind his back. I mean, my husband's older than me, but not that old. He wasn't alive during Stalin's time, but his legacy lived on. And that was actually why my husband, who has a PhD in protein biochemistry, and all of his colleagues left the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, because even though they had all the opportunities at that point that their Western colleagues did, they couldn't catch up to the damage that had been done. And the damage that had been done was largely through this exact same mechanism, changing what words actually mean, changing what science actually is. Lysenko, Trofim Lysenko, was an agronomist who basically made up new ways of growing crops that didn't work, but it helped Stalin achieve these political objectives. And so they believed in it with all of their hearts, even though they literally knew and understood that it didn't work. And they passed laws. They outlawed Mendelian genetics because that was against what Lysenko's method showed. And that's exactly the same kind of thing that we're seeing in HHS when they're changing what words even mean. I mean, you have Kennedy saying things about clinical trials, talking about, I'll talk about viruses. He's used terminology like antigenic drift, for example, to describe COVID. Antigenic drift and antigenic shift are terms that have to do with influenza.
Yep.
And it's not just that we only use those for flu just because. We specifically use them for flu because it describes two things that flu can do, one of which SARS coronavirus 2 cannot, and that's reassortment. And this has to do with influenza biology. So these are terms that have meaning to scientists. They have scientific meaning. Kennedy just uses them to basically advance whatever type of policy he's trying to put forward. I completely agree with you. I think Kennedy is incredibly smart. I think that he is smart, and he knows that what he's doing is incorrect. What he's saying is wrong. It's a lie. The fact that he knows that it's wrong makes it a lie and not just a mistake. But he is actively lying because he believes in this. And that is the difference between a scientist and a person who is letting their faith and ideology drive them. A scientist is going to go where the evidence leads them. And I know that's a very cliched term, but that's what scientists do. We change our minds about what we think is happening if the evidence suggests that our original hypothesis was incorrect. That's the fundamental core of the scientific method. You prove yourself wrong. And oftentimes we do. A hypothesis that failed testing is still a successful hypothesis because it was tested. The person, though, who is like Kennedy, going to be operating on belief and prioritizing that, is going to do exactly what we saw him do in that hearing yesterday. He is going to start with something that's kind of true, and then he's going to make up lies about it. And that's because his beliefs to him are more important than the truth. And this is where it comes down to it for me. It is not a scientific question any longer. It becomes a moral question. At what point do we say this is completely unacceptable to have a Health and Human Services secretary who is, because of his beliefs, making policy decisions that affect the very lives of every single American and disproportionately our children?
Yep. I have to echo the sentiment of some of my colleagues and feel like this wasn't a bad day on the Hill for RFK Jr.
No.
It definitely felt like he got away with being this, answer evading, word salad giving charlatan that he is. And it's really concerning because we are in a very, very consequential political year with midterm elections coming just around the corner. And all of this feels like the message prep that he got and the messages that he shared were all with that in mind. We have shared before with this audience that this very much public health, so many topics in public health, especially vaccines, used to be a very, very purple issue. And then it now has become cobalt blue versus flaming red. And the red team is doing everything they can to win by any means necessary, including how and when they tell Bobby to speak, including how and when they tell him that he can or cannot talk about vaccines. I mean, the guy was on Joe Rogan and didn't use the word vaccine once. Like that is very, very methodical. This is all part of a plan. And I really think he got off yesterday with very, very little cost or damage done to his reputation as HHS secretary, because he was given enough airtime, especially from the supportive members of Congress who were saying things, in between the God bless yous and we love you and our families are such good friends and we think you're cool, that his beliefs on other things were somehow okay to justify the stuff that he was being critiqued on. I mean, he has continued to be Teflon when it comes to the label of anti-vaccine, because he says, well, I still believe in cancer vaccines and I still believe in the universal flu vaccine. But he still then throws in, but we still need to have rigorous testing and better studies for safety because we don't do that. And we haven't done that. It's just really sad, honestly, Angie, when I think that this was not a bad day for him. And what I'm really hoping is that on the 22nd, when he's in front of the health committee, that it's a really bad day for him, because that really is the committee that I am looking much more, with much more scrutiny on, because they're the ones that put him in this position in the first place.
And they're the ones with the power to impeach him.
True.
And I think that that's something that this is the reason, Jess, why we need to keep talking about this, because I agree with you and many of our colleagues who we've been chatting about this with. Unfortunately, we all watched it and we're like, it's bonkers, like as usual, like the clown car rides again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's red-faced, he's screaming at people, he's getting in multiple fights, he's acting completely unhinged and unprofessional and not at all like anybody would want the health secretary to act. But you know what? Every single, practically without fail, Republican on both committees said, thank you so much, Secretary Kennedy, for being here. Everybody from both parties talked about how much they loved his family, loved his uncle, loved his dad, and how important it was to their family, their own families, the Kennedy family. Start off with say something nice. But then the Democrats, some of them had a gentler touch than others, but they just pretty much all went for the jugular. The many different things they could go after. The Republicans, every single one of them, thanked him profusely for coming, told him that they agree with this, that, the other thing, sometimes everything. We had multiple physicians on both committees talking about, the harm done by lockdowns and repeating many of these same lies that they also know are not true. Things like the US did worse than anybody else in the world in their COVID response, and we had more deaths than anybody else. So the the Republican Congress people are repeating his lies back to him. To me, that suggests that he's doing pretty well so far on his mission to rein in the crazy stuff and talk about eating real food rather than all those chemicals that the Maha people don't like, or all those vaccines that the Maha people don't like, but the voters do. And so until the Republicans start going harder at him, as far as I'm concerned, he's in the good graces of the Trump administration. But you're absolutely right. The Help Committee is really important because they do have the power to actually initiate impeachment proceedings.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked in the past a lot about Senator Bill Cassidy, who was responsible for advancing him from the Help Committee and him getting confirmed. He was the deciding vote. And boy, I'm sure he regrets that, although he won't admit to it, because even though he's already getting primaried by a MAGA loyalist, he still seems to think he's got a chance of like staying within like the mainstream Republican, Trump aligned fold. So he's not willing to come out and denounce Kennedy altogether. And Kennedy hasn't fallen out of Trump's good graces yet either. It remains to be seen how he's going to be doing with the Maha moms who are, on the crazy side of the spectrum, the crazy wellness side of the spectrum, and how their interests are, at odds with the MAGA squad that doesn't give a good goddamn about, their environmental concerns and their food concerns and things like that. So I think the moral of the story for me is that even though this was a short-term victory, we can still make it a Pyrrhic victory by just continuing to talk about all the crazy shit and all the lies that he told under oath. I mean, this might be a short-term thing where he's not getting called for this, but let's say that the Senate finally grows a pair, better yet, the Senate flips and the Republicans are no longer the majority after December. Well, then you're going to have to bring an impeachment case against him unless he resigns or is fired. And if you bring that impeachment case, you're going to need to bring evidence with that. All of this is evidence, really important evidence, that he has lied multiple times, specifically about being an anti-vaxxer. And he did so a bunch of times yesterday. And he'll probably do so again on Wednesday.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about measles for a second, because this came up and became a hot fight between members of Congress and Trump and RFK Jr., who repeatedly deflected from the conversation, the actual conversation at hand, which was about how he was absolutely behind the instruction to the CDC to remove their campaigns about harm reduction from flu vaccines, specifically talking about the wild to mild flu vaccine campaign, and how he basically said that measles is worse in other places, that ours is not as bad, and that he wanted to compare ours to Mexico and to Canada. And that basically ours was just not that bad. He lied. The fact is, ours is that bad. Ours is extremely bad. All signs still point to us losing our measles elimination status, which we earned back in 2000, with a new state as of the last couple of weeks coming up as the front runner, as a new epicenter of the national outbreak, and that is Utah, with more than 600 cases. This is not normal. We are not seeing normal numbers of measles. And yet what he was trying to do was say it's normal, that what we're seeing now is not only normal, it's not as bad as other places. And I just want to, can we pull up perhaps that slide? Yes. This was shared by HHS on their official government platform, saying that they were revealing the truth about the measles cases, that last year's measles caseload was significantly lower than in Mexico, Canada, and the European Union. Now, Angie, why don't you tell me maybe a couple things why this is flawed?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not true. These are the 2025 numbers, and the outbreaks in Mexico and Canada are the same outbreak as the U.S.
Exactly.
So separating them is only really an administrative matter of separating which cases are being managed by which country's health system. But they're all the same outbreak. And that's because the cases in Texas that started the US outbreak were from travelers who lived in Texas. So not foreigners. They were Americans who traveled to Ontario, Canada, to a family gathering, within their community. They're in the Mennonite community. And they brought back measles with them because there was already an outbreak going on in Ontario in that community that had been brought from Europe to a family gathering, I believe, somewhere in Atlantic Canada, I think Newfoundland. So, it was already brought in to Canada, to North America, brought from Canada to the US by people in the same community. And then, oh, guess what? There's a bunch of people who are in big Mennonite communities in Mexico as well. So somebody went from Texas to visit their friends and family in Mexico, and then they came back, but they brought measles with them to Mexico. And so then there's a big outbreak in Mexico. And there's other things that happen in other countries. For example, vaccines are administered differently in other countries, and there are different vaccine recommendations and availability of vaccines. In Canada, including in the Mennonite community, which doesn't already have a very high vaccination uptake rate because the community is not necessarily anti-vax, but they're distrusting of the medical system, and they just choose not to avail themselves of many different vaccines. So it's not quite the same thing as like, oh, we're getting a non-medical exemption. It's sort of religious, but it's just more that vaccination messaging is not something that reaches this community a lot, and it's not a priority for them. It's clearly an area that does need more outreach. But in any case, it's a very connected community. So that's driven some of it for this outbreak, but it is beyond that community now. In the US and in Canada, long-term, long-standing anti-vax campaigns have reduced the vaccination rate very gradually over time. This is something that Kennedy said yesterday, too, that you can't blame him for these measles epidemics. Mm-hmm. He's done a great job of managing them. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you can blame him because he is correct that this is being driven by school-age children. It is not being driven by the Mennonite community anymore. It's being driven by school-age kids who didn't get vaccinated 7 or 8 years ago because their parents decided not to vaccinate them when they were babies. The reason for that is RFK Jr. too, because his organization, Children's Health Defense, is the #1 purveyor of Orwellian propaganda. They are the brain trust that actually decides how we're going to rename other words. They're the brain trust that says, hey, we're going to take this kid, this unvaccinated kid who died of measles, and turn it into an opportunity to convince other people not to vaccinate their kids so that they can maybe die too. Mm-hmm. And that sounds crazy, but that is literally what they do. And one of the ways that they do this is through graphics and figures like this. This is total bullshit because, yes, this is the number of confirmed cases. But keep in mind that there's a temporal element to this too. There were already a lot of cases in Canada when the U.S. had its first case. The U.S. caught up, it's catching up, but it hasn't quite caught up there yet. We are closing the gap, but Canada is still holding its own because it has a bunch of measles cases too. It has a huge outbreak too for the same reason. Again, it is because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and all of his anti-vax friends have been doing this for decades. They've been putting out stuff like this to convince people not to get vaccinated. This is not the truth about measles across the globe. These are some numbers without any context. What you would see if you look at the US numbers now is that we are at over 1,800 cases, closing in on 1,900, and it is not even May yet. We are not even halfway done with the year yet, and we are almost at the total number of cases we had last time, and this is almost even worse undercount than it was last year. So this is the most wildly misleading tweet, and it's actually heartbreaking to see it coming from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
To your point about these not being separate outbreaks because of how interconnected the spread was between these countries, isn't it amazing, though, that you're talking about the U.S., Canada, and Mexico on one continent being separated, but you have the European Union, not a country, as
Not
the
a country.
comparison. So you're going to compare all of the European countries against these 3 countries who also make up a region. But let's do the math. Add those numbers up, and the North American outbreak, which is the epicenter was the US. The North American outbreak, which includes Mexico, Canada, and the US, was greater than the EU, and it was still an undercount.
Yep. A big time undercount. And not for the same reasons. I mean, for some of the same reasons. The EU, some countries have even higher rate of vaccine refusal than the US does. Some are comparable with the US and Canada and Mexico. Mexico, though, there's one state in Mexico that's had a huge number of all these measles cases, and it's actually not because of anti-vax stuff. It's because of a supply chain issue that interfered with ordering vaccines. So there were several years where people basically just didn't have access, and I think it was the Chihuahua state.
It was Chihuahua.
And they just couldn't vaccinate at all. And so there's a huge population of unvaccinated people because of the supply chain issue, which just goes to show that, you know, vaccination campaigns and maintaining herd immunity. And in the case of measles, it's 95% vaccination uptake that you have to have in order to maintain herd immunity. So it requires a lot of work on a lot of different fronts. You have to combat the propaganda and the lies of people like Kennedy. And you also have to make sure that the system is robust enough to handle things like a supply chain issue that would affect all of your vaccine orders for your entire population if you're, say, the governor of the Chihuahua state in Mexico. So it's a really complicated thing. But when things get complicated, and also I should add, quite boring for most people. I mean, most people, you know, I talk about this all the time, probably because sometimes I get bored talking about this stuff. So for the average person, like, this just is not going to be the most gripping story. You know, you're probably going to be more interested in the plummeting price of oil now that the Strait of Hormuz is open, and less concerned that HHS is posting bullshit about measles cases around the world and what's a country and what's not. But, you know, that's what they count on. They count on it being boring, and they count on being able to explain it in a way that grabs your attention and satisfies any curiosity you might have about the topic, and just says, here, look at this. Everybody's lying to you. Everybody's wrong. Look at our simple figure. There's a red arrow going down in everything. US is #1 at, like, not having the most measles because it's a global measles epidemic. And I mean, that is a really, really sneaky way, back to the point that RFK Jr. is actually very smart. That is a really, really sneaky way of avoiding accountability for what is quite literally his job and his responsibility to prevent measles outbreaks like the one we are having in the United States, regardless of what any other country is experiencing. His job is to stop that measles outbreak, and he has not done a good job.
Yeah. There's a lot to say about this, but I honestly want folks to make sure that they tune in on the 22nd, because I really think that while he seemed to have dodged a few bullets yesterday, this is a great time between now and the 22nd to call your representatives, especially if they're on the help committee, and tell them to ask tougher questions. Tell them to get him to say with his whole chest what he actually believes about a lot of these things, and to not let him get away with the type of deflections and misrememberings of everything. I mean, even his remarks on COVID mortality was just so unbelievable. I mean, it was not that long ago at the first hearing where he denied the deaths, 1.2 million people dying, and blamed it on chaos at the CDC, but then also was trying to say that we had the worst deaths. I mean, we had a lot of deaths, but if you look at the data and compare mortality rates, we didn't have the highest mortality rate. We just had a very, very high mortality. And
10 times the deaths of Europe, Jess. 10 times the deaths, leading the world in mortality rates from COVID, just as we're leading in the world in non-measles case rates.
I mean, I know that this offends me as an epidemiologist because it's my job to be precise about numbers and data about things like mortality and morbidity, but it should offend everybody. that this guy is being so imprecise about something as precious even as people dying from COVID. This absolute heartlessness to talk about measles incidents, COVID incidents, hepatitis incidents, all these things that cause real harm on real people and real lives. And he speaks about them with such disregard for the truth. It should offend everybody, not just the folks who are trying to be pure about the data.
Yeah, no, what to me is, again, the craziest thing about all of this is he's sitting there, he's getting more and more pissed off and agitated.
Yeah.
That people are asking him to be accountable for the fact that literally children will die as a result of the policies that he believes in. Not just thinks are a good idea. He's not trying to just argue for this is the policy that politically, I think is going to work best in our system of government. He believes this, like it is something that he deeply like feels, and it's his life's work and his life's mission. And the result is that children die. I just don't understand how this is ever okay. I mean, this would never be okay under any sort of, even in the most like sort of morally flexible situations. I can't think of an arrangement in, what my conscience allows me to do where I would ever advocate for these policies. And it just is, it's mind boggling to me that, Congress people, Republicans primarily, although there are several Democrats who were quite friendly to Kennedy as well, even as they were, criticizing him. Some were harsher in their criticisms than others, that's for sure. There are some people who like him and who think that he does have unconventional ideas. But the fact is, I don't care what bullshit he tells you. He's saying shit that you want to hear. He will continue to say it. When I was in college and undergraduate, I sold Cutco knives, as many
people. Did you really?
Yes, I sure did. And I have a steak knife, an engraved steak knife that says I'm a member of the President's Club.
Incredible.
I sold more than $10,000 worth of fine kitchen cutlery in one summer. I was really good at it. You know why I quit? Because I just didn't I sold a couple people knives that I just didn't feel good about it. I didn't think that they could afford them. And it was their choice to buy the knives. I didn't force them to buy them, but just didn't like the way that it made me feel. And also I didn't really like the work. Like, they were good knives. And I actually still have my demo set. I'm going to send them back to the factory in Ollie in New York to get them sharpened.
Incredible.
I didn't like that. They taught us all these techniques though. And I recognize a lot of these sales techniques in what Kennedy does. There was something called the objection cycle. Mm-hmm. And the objection cycle is, no, I can't afford the Homemaker Plus A. That was like the big deluxe knife set that we had. It came with 8 steak knives. I can't afford that. Well, what about the payment plan? Oh, I don't want to do the payment plan. I want to pay in cash all up front. Okay, well, how about the galley set? Well, I don't like that either. I wish it came with this knife instead of that knife. Well, how about I sub that one in? Or how about I give you a free peeler if you buy it? There were all these different options. You could just keep giving people different options until you found the one that they would agree to. And sometimes they would just get so fucking sick of you being like professional and friendly college student who's really persistent. And you can imagine I was really good at this. Just talking your ear off in a kitchen, because you get them to invite you over. The objection cycle worked. And that's what Kennedy does. He either annoys people or just, keeps at them until he finally wears them down into agreeing with him, or at least just not criticizing him anymore because he's Teflon, like you said. I mean, it is a really, really effective technique. And I think that the only way I can think of to really bust through it is to keep talking about it so that more people recognize it when they see it. Yeah. Because it does jump out completely to me. And, when as we said, we're going to be covering the help committee thing. And I think that one in particular, we might want to do a play-by-play on. Yeah. Just because there is going to be so much wild shit coming up. And Cassidy and the other people, the Democrats on the help committee, Patty Murray, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, I mean, they have all, and actually every single Democrat on that committee has really, really gone for his throat They are just on his neck. And I think there's going to be a lot of really exciting moments that seem like they're really boring because they're going to be about like the hepatitis B vaccine and stuff. But Cassidy, I mean, the one time Cassidy, I think, gets to take out his anger on Kennedy is when he's got Kennedy in there. And so he comes up with these questions that just like really make him squirm. I got to give it to Cassidy. He's very clever at trying to trap people. And Kennedy is a great one where he tried to get Kennedy. He asked Kennedy a question about Operation Warp Speed that basically forced Kennedy to either say that Operation Warp Speed and COVID vaccines were the best thing ever, or say that President Trump sucked and Operation Warp Speed was a failure. So Kennedy obviously didn't do that. And that was the one time where Cassidy really got it. I mean, Kennedy didn't answer the question, but that to me suggests like what an effective question it was. Kennedy pretty much melted down. So it's going to be really exciting, I think, and we'll be there covering it. And please join us, because what we want to do is turn you all into like RFK Jr. bullshit sniffing dogs, like we are. So, maybe something cooler than a dog, although I'm a dog lover.
I would say the last plug is, if this has been helpful, please spread the word. We want this stuff to be free and accessible to as many people. We're not paywalling any of this. You don't have to be a paid subscriber to see this content. Please share it widely in your circles. Tell people to subscribe for free and follow and share, because again, our whole job here is to give you the tools in your toolkit, the senses in your nose to detect the BS and be more informed to make better choices for yourself and your family. So spread the word and catch us here again next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And actually, you know what? That wasn't the last plug. I have a related last plug. So actually 2 related last plugs. One of them is an apology as well. The Maha Morbidity and Weekly Maha Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, our newsletter that accompanies this podcast. Guess what? It's not out this week yet because it's been a busy week. So I apologize for that. It's going to come right now. It's going to be more of a weekly recap, but next week, I'm going to say we're going to have it out on Wednesdays now, just to give ourselves that extra day. We're going to really be better about this. So you can count on that. The other thing is that I have a new show to announce, that is part of our little podcasting family here. And it's going to be called MVPs, Making Viruses Pop, also Making Vincent Proud, because it is with my PhD colleague, Dr. Juliet Morrison, who also trained with Vincent Racaniello at the same time that I did. So we're going to have a show every Sunday. Not sure what time yet, so I'll get back to you about that. But we're going to have a show every Sunday called MVPs, and we're going to be just talking about viruses, kind of like this, but it's going to be more of we're focusing on virology. On the virology behind vaccines and whatever viruses happen to be in the news. So we just realized we really like talking about virology together, and we really like making fun of how bad I am at cloning. So catch that. Look out for the MMWR. It'll be an exciting weekend review for you. And come back and see us next week for some more special episodes of Taking Shots, which we will be doing again in conjunction with our friends at the Save America Movement. Thanks, everybody, so much. Thanks, Jess, and have a great weekend.
You too. Stay healthy. Bye, y'all.
Yeah, you too. And you know what? There's always next week for actually having shots again at our happy hour podcast, where I
can't stop hydrating because I'm just so parched these days.
Same here. Electrolytes in here. So yeah, and the Stanley Cup's dirty, so I got to use a slightly smaller Yeti. Anyways, yeah, right. I'm going to go have a drink at some point for the weekend.
Enjoy.
So everybody do that. Have a great weekend, everyone. Stay healthy. Get shots. Vaccinations.